So I wrote something because I'm a novelist. I've written 8 books now, and so this could be a complete and absolute failure, and this is weird and about dreaming. I have a book coming out in a month that kind of takes up the subject of dreams. So if you fall asleep and start dreaming, I will not be offended in any way. I sort of feel completely out of my element. It's funny, I contacted Piero a while ago because a few years ago, some friends and I, who are writers, all of us creative writers, were like, we should get together with other people in the Bay Area who are not in our field, scientists and other folks, and have exchanges and talks. I suggested we do it in a bar. So when I found out this is great, I still think the bar or beer would be a great addition to this. But, so I'm just going to read you this thing that I wrote. Because I don't know what I think if I don't write my way through it. And I don't really know because I've never shared it with anyone, and I sort of wrote it for today. I rarely give talks, and when I do, it is usually to an audience of aspiring creative writers about literature and craft and the imagination, which is to say thank you, Piero, for inviting me to talk today to a different audience, and also perhaps I might seek your sympathy outright. I think I already did. Please bear with me and we'll see where this small talk of dreams, Henry Corbin and his imaginal world, a bit of Dante before that, and some about my own forthcoming illuminated book, a small novel about a house where people go to dream. It's called The Brick House. And where this will all lead us, which is in a dream, maybe no place in particular. But perhaps since I'm last tonight, and as we ease toward the end of our waking day, an inch closer to our dreaming one, you will allow me this leeway. Last night, I dreamed various stories, but one in particular I recall, in which I had borrowed a friend's mountain bike, but he doesn't own a mountain bike in real life that I know of. And this bike was equipped with panniers on the back as if for a long journey. Then I found myself on a very steep mountain path in a remote wild place, thousands of feet high in the air, for I could see the tops of clouds below me from where I stood with my bike on the bare, treeless outcropping. And suddenly, hundreds of other cyclists rode past me, or were already ahead of me, all of them American-looking with expensive bicycles and state-of-the-art helmets and shorts and other gear. And although I felt great trepidation for the steep and difficult climb that awaited me, I remember thinking that I had to have faith and trust in God, which in my waking life might not at all be the kind of thought that would come to my mind or that I would take comfort in. But I have recurring dreams of this nature, about needing to cross an enormous bridge or climb a steep mountain path or drive over a tall freeway overpass, and the terror I feel at the moment that I begin the ascent, before the ascent. Recently, actually about only 15 minutes before penning this very sentence for the first time, several days before last night's dream, I read an article in an online newspaper in which the Italian neurologist Giuseppe Piazzi put forth the theory that if the Divine Comedy were read literally and not symbolically, it would demonstrate how the poet Dante suffered from narcolepsy. In the opening to the comedy, the poet writes, quote, how midway in the journey of our life, I found myself, that extraordinary use of the word our always makes me catch my breath, midway in the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood where the straight way was lost. He goes on to recount how he can't say how he found himself in the wood, for, quote, I was so full of sleep at the moment I left the true way, end quote. The poet then encounters 3 wild animals at the base of the hill, the lion, the leopard, the she-wolf, who bar his ascent. Virgil, of course, quickly arrives on the scene and says he will guide him, and that he cannot ascend the mountain as he wishes, but must instead descend to eventually make it up to his empire, his city, his kingdom, the kingdom of God. It is Dante's line, quote, so full of sleep, end quote, that Piazzi cites as support for his theory, or part of his theory, of his excessive daytime sleepiness. I find it extraordinary when it is suggested that works of imaginative literature be read literally. It makes no sense to me because stories, myths, literature seek through their metaphoric language epiphanies that are beyond simple conclusions and easy understanding. They encode knowledge via symbolic form. I might even say, agreeing with Joseph Campbell, that it is exactly this literal-mindedness in the West which has gotten us into all kinds of trouble and is fundamentally a dead end for reading. Certainly, it is very reductive. Perhaps some of this kind of reading has come out of our schools, or books are used in language departments. Doesn't the rise of the English department in the mid-19th century coincide with the formatting and consolidating of the nation state and the national identity? Yes, it does. To codify culture and ideas more is to make doctoral dissertations, to come to conclusions, to argue, or these days sometimes as studies in which an author's purported blindness or prejudices are called out. But literature, of course, exceeds fads and must ultimately be known by itself, through the experience of reading, a solitary individual act where the consciousness of the reader meets that of the books. Even though I today write novels, I still find myself wordless before the great mystery of a great book, and the experience I sometimes have when I am taken out and altered in some way, when I experience what James Joyce called an aesthetic shock, or what some might call the sublime. Things which outreach comprehension, but which nonetheless are experienced. As I look back, I think that it is likely that it was those few times I had this experience as a child and young adult which led me inevitably, but not obviously, for I never thought or planned to be a writer, to the writing of books. For I encountered something on occasion which I can only describe as transcendent and beyond myself and part of something large and terribly, deeply human. But perhaps I'm not being fair to Dr. Piazzi's work and his conclusions about the Commedia and Dante's Narcolepsy, for I quoted you a third source in English, a summary far removed from its original paper in Italian, published in 2013. The Wonders of the Internet and Our Information Age. Still, it seemed a funny kind of assertion and reminded me of another Italian, the wonderful Italo Calvino, who is no longer with us, who discussed what he called an epidemic in his essay, Exactitude. He said, quote, "It seems to me that a pestilence has struck the human race in its most distinctive faculty, that is, the use of words. I don't wish to dwell on the possible sources of this epidemic, whether they are to be sought in politics, ideology, bureaucratic uniformity, the monotony of mass media, or the ways schools dispense the culture of the mediocre. What interests me are the possibilities of health. Literature, and perhaps literature alone, can create the antibodies to fight this plague in language." End quote. You might imagine how Calvino's essay, which goes on to postulate the necessity of literature for culture, makes this writer, me, feel better about her job and how she spends much of her time reading and rereading books, discovering affinities which I never knew with writers long dead and these human-made artifacts which have crossed time and space and language and culture, and like birds take flight in my imagination, often in conversation with one another now, or mixed together and sometimes mixed up entirely, so that Dante's Commedia sits near William Blake's Illuminated the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and alongside Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector's Soulstorm, and next to Mexican writer Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo, like books adjacent on a shelf or piled as they were while I prepared this small talk on my desk. About a year ago, on one of my many other internet stumblings down another rabbit hole of clicks, this one perhaps more significant than Narcolepsy and the Old Florentine Poet, I found the work of Sufi scholar and philosopher Henry Corbin through an essay called Mundus Imaginalis, or the Imaginary and Imaginal. In this piece, a paper he delivered in 1964 in Paris at the Colloquium on Symbolism, he talks about what he terms the imaginal world, a place of encounter, a world of the soul and of the dead, where human and divine imaginations meet and intelligible archetypes enter knowledge, where thinking and being are not divorced. The active imagination, as he calls it, is the organ of supersensible perception. He asserts that between the empirical world and the world of abstract intellect, there is another that is, quote, both intermediary and intermediate, the world of the image, end quote, and how this world requires its own faculty of perception, namely imaginative power. You might perhaps understand how this too makes a writer who spends her days staring out the window and pulling stories like threads out of an invisible cloth of her imagination feel happier or more accompanied, in a sense less crazy about her dedication to letters, less out of sync with so much of society which seems to value predominantly the making of money, the having of good jobs, good careers, the accumulation of things, easy to consume TV-style stories with high production values and the rest of it. Not silence or inactivity or daydreaming and staring out the window or stillness. Corbin goes on to distinguish what he calls, quote, active imagination, an epiphanic place for the images of the archetypal world. He distinguishes that from fantasy or merely the imaginary. He says, quote, it is customary to juxtapose the real and the imaginary, as if the latter were unreal. The active imagination is a form of cognition, not avoidance, not distraction. This too is something I sense so deeply, but even with my own students of creative writing is something I struggle to convey. How the imaginary is not unreal, how what we can think of as serious or great literature is a deep engagement with the real. Corbin would argue that the imagination has been suppressed for centuries, and how what we think of as Cartesianism recognizes nothing but thinking and extension. The vast realm of the imagination of what he would say is the soul proper has fallen into disgrace. There are many things in Corbin's work that I don't fully begin to comprehend. I've only started reading his studies of Sufi works, but I've been returning to his short essay again and again, and beginning, as my mind always wants to do, to find the connection pattern between his work on Islamic mysticism and Eastern philosophy and the Western traditions, which I'm more familiar with, which until recently, perhaps because it was certainly never a part of my formal education, I didn't realize had themselves been heavily influenced by the East. For books have always moved around. They might sit in one place for a time, and then in translation find a new life hundreds of years later. I'm thinking now of the example of Greek literature in Europe and its, quote, rediscovery in the 15th century, and of course of the Arab scholars and others who were translating and keeping those books alive during the Middle Ages. I had a teacher in graduate school who was born and educated in Mumbai who used to say to me how all roads lead to India. Perhaps she's right. So many certainly lead to the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita. I'm thinking of Schopenhauer, Emerson, T.S. Eliot. The traveling of ideas, of knowledge and stories and movements and development of language itself, all of these things continue to obsess and fascinate me. I said to you at the beginning of this very small talk that I would speak about my small book forthcoming in November called The Brick House, about a house where people go to dream. I could tell you of its influences that I still recall: Calvino, the Japanese writer Yasunari Kawabata, Lee Spector, William Blake, and how he revived the illuminated manuscript, Armenian illuminated manuscripts, some of which were hand-carried out of Turkey in 1915 during the genocide, which I saw when visiting the Museum of the Book in Yerevan a few years ago. As in many cultures, for the Armenians, the book is sacred. But in really, I have nothing to say about it. It's, for it itself, says everything that it takes up, including some of the ideas I've tried, however clumsily, to talk about now. But of writing itself, I can say this. Perhaps it is a sustained dreaming, an engagement with the unknown, the intuited, with wonder, with secrets, with the dead, with the not said, with the imaginal world, with the soul. And this, if nothing else, also that to make a book takes a certain amount of faith during the long years it takes for it to find final form. And perhaps later tonight, when I return to the land of dreams, as you will also, there will be another mountain to climb on another friend's borrowed mountain bike, or several beasts to slay in the dark wood. And some of these narratives may make their way eventually across a bridge of language into a book or a talk one day, quite like the one I just gave. And I think that was under 20 minutes.
Way under.
Great.